They sold her for less than the price of a bottle of whiskey. In the unforgiving winter of 1874, in a lawless mining camp called Broken Ridge, a woman was dragged onto a makeshift stage with a filthy burlap sack tied over her head. The crowd laughed. They threw mud. They called her damaged goods. But Silas Blackwood, a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in 6 months, didn't laugh. He saw the way her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from terror. He slammed his last silver dollar on the barrel. The town mocked him for buying a pig in a poke, but when he cut those ropes and she finally spoke, the truth she revealed would bring the entire territory to its knees. The wind howled through the valley of Broken Ridge like a dying wolf, carrying the scent of pine, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. It was a place where hope went to freeze to death, a ramshackle collection of tents and leaning wooden shacks huddled at the base of the Bitterroot Mountains. Silas Blackwood adjusted the heavy fur pack on his shoulders. He was a giant of a man, standing 6'4" with a beard the color of iron and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He came down from his cabin near the timberline only twice a year, once before the first snow, and once when the thaw broke the rivers. Today, he was here for salt, ammunition, and flour, nothing more. He had no interest in the noise coming from outside the Rusty Pick saloon. A crowd of miners, drifters, and trappers had formed a tight circle, their breath misting in the freezing air. They were jeering, their laughter cruel and jagged. Silas intended to walk past them to the general store, but the sound of a whip cracking against wood made him pause. "Step right up, gentlemen. Don't be shy." The voice belonged to Cyrus Snake Calloway, a man whose reputation was as greasy as his slicked-back hair. Calloway was a drifter who dealt in cards, horses, and, rumors said, stolen things. Silas peered over the heads of the crowd. Calloway was standing on an overturned crate. Beside him, tethered by a coarse rope around her wrists, stood a figure. It was a woman. She was small, shivering violently in a thin, tattered grey dress that offered no protection against the biting wind. But the most disturbing part was the hood. A rough, stained burlap sack had been pulled over her head and tied at the neck, completely obscuring her face. 2 crude holes had been cut for eyes, but from where Silas stood, he saw only darkness within them. "What you got there, Snake?" a toothless miner shouted. "A dog or a woman?" The crowd erupted in laughter. "A little of both, maybe." Calloway grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Found her wandering the pass near Deadwood. No name, no family, and by the looks of it, no sense neither. Won't speak a word, dumb as a post. Why's she got the sack on?" another man yelled. Calloway's face darkened, a theatrical grimace of disgust crossing his features. "Trust me, boys, you don't want to see what's under there. Face looks like it went 10 rounds with a wildcat. She's ugly as sin, but she's got strong hands. She can scrub floors, skin rabbits, and keep your fire going. Who'll start the bidding at $5? Silence fell over the group. In the West, beauty was rare, but a woman with a face like a wildcat was a hard sell, even to lonely men. $5? The miner scoffed. "For a mute Scarface, I wouldn't pay 2. The woman on the crate flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of her shoulders, but Silas saw it. He saw the way her fingers, blue with cold, clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't just cold. She was humiliated. She was terrified. "Come on now," Calloway wheedled, grabbing her shoulder roughly. She stumbled, nearly falling off the crate. "Look at the teeth." "Well, never mind the teeth. Look at the arms. Workhorse, this one. $3. Still no one spoke. The men began to lose interest, turning back toward the warmth of the saloon. "Fine. $1, Calloway spat, shoving the woman forward. "1 single dollar for a servant to cook your beans, or I'll leave her tied to a tree for the wolves. Makes no difference to me." The cruelty of it struck Silas in the chest like a physical blow. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who wanted to be left alone, a man running from his own ghosts. But he knew what it felt like to be discarded. He knew what it felt like to be looked at as something less than human. He looked at the woman again. She stood perfectly still now, accepting her fate. The resignation in her posture broke something inside him. The crowd was already dispersing. Calloway looked ready to make good on his threat and shove her into the mud. "I'll take her." The voice was deep, rumbling like thunder in a canyon. The crowd parted as Silas Blackwood stepped forward. He towered over the miners, his bear-skin coat making him look like a beast from the folklore they told around campfires. Calloway squinted at him. "The mountain man. Silas, ain't it?" Silas didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy silver dollar. It was the last of his coin for the season. It meant he'd be going without coffee and tobacco for the next 6 months. He flipped the coin. It caught the weak winter sun before landing in Calloway's greedy palm. "Sold," Calloway cackled, quickly pocketing the money before the giant changed his mind. He untied the rope from the post and tossed the end to Silas. "She's your problem now, big man. Don't say I didn't warn you about the face." Silas didn't look at Calloway. He looked at the woman. He didn't pull the rope. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence blocking the wind. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff but low. "Let's get you out of this mud." The crowd snickered as Silas led the woman away, the burlap sack still over her head. "Gonna be a long winter up there with a scarecrow, Silas," someone shouted. Silas ignored them. He walked toward the livery stable where his mule Buster was waiting. The woman followed him, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground, her breathing ragged within the sack. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what was under that mask. He had just spent his last dollar on a mystery that might kill him, but as he lifted her onto the back of his mule, he felt a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach. Fate had just played a card, and Silas had no idea what the stakes were yet. The journey up the mountain was brutal. The snow began to fall in earnest an hour after they left Broken Ridge, thickening the air with white silence. Silas walked ahead, leading the mule, while the woman rode. He had offered her his spare blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders over that hideous grey dress. She hadn't made a sound. Not a whimper, not a cry, not a word of thanks. Silas's mind raced as he trudged through the drifts. What have I done? He was a man who valued his solitude above all else. His cabin was a sanctuary, a place where he didn't have to explain his scars or his past. Now he was bringing a stranger into it. A woman Calloway claimed was disfigured and mute. Was she dangerous? Was she mad? It took 4 hours to reach the cabin, a sturdy log structure built into the side of a cliff, sheltered by towering pines. By the time they arrived, the sun had set, and the world was awash of dark blues and greys. Silas helped her down from the mule. She was stiff from the cold and the ride. Her legs buckled when she hit the ground, and Silas caught her. For a second, he felt the fragility of her frame against his massive chest. She smelled of stale burlap and fear. But underneath that, there was a faint scent. Something like lavender, out of place in this wilderness. "Inside," he grunted, opening the heavy oak door. The cabin was freezing, the fire having died out hours ago. Silas guided her to the rough-hewn chair near the hearth. "Sit, don't move." He went to work with practiced efficiency, striking flint and steel, feeding kindling until a roar of yellow flame chased the shadows away. He lit a kerosene lamp and placed it on the table. Only then did he turn to look at her. She was sitting exactly where he'd put her, her hands folded in her lap. The burlap sack was still on her head. It looked grotesque in the flickering firelight, a monstrous mask on a delicate body. Silas pulled out his hunting knife. The woman flinched violently, shrinking back into the chair. "Easy," Silas said, raising his hands. "I ain't gonna hurt you, but I ain't having you sit in my house wearing a feed sack. You can breathe freely here." He stepped closer. She was trembling so hard the chair rattled against the floorboards. He could hear her breath hitching, fast and shallow. She was expecting a blow. She was expecting the worst. "Hold still," he murmured. With surgical precision, he slid the sharp blade under the coarse rope at her neck and severed it. The tension released. He sheathed the knife and reached out with a large, calloused hand to grasp the top of the burlap sack. "If you're burnt or cut or whatever Calloway said, it don't matter to me," Silas said, trying to reassure her. "I've seen ugly things before. I look in the mirror every morning." He pulled the sack upward. It slid off easily. The woman ducked her head immediately, her hair, matted and tangled, the color of dark honey, falling forward to curtain her face. "Look at me," Silas commanded gently. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her chin. Silas Blackwood, a man who had stared down grizzly bears and survived avalanches without blinking, felt the breath leave his lungs. There were no scars. There were no burns. Her face was not the face of a wildcat. It was the most beautiful, haunting face he had ever seen. High cheekbones, a straight, noble nose, and skin that, despite the dirt and grime, was smooth and pale as porcelain. But it was her eyes that pinned him to the spot. They were a startling, piercing violet, a colour so rare it seemed unnatural. One of her eyes was swollen shut, bruised purple and black, likely from a backhand. Her lip was split. But the disfigurement Calloway had preached about, it was a lie to hide her value, or a lie to hide her identity. She stared at him, terror warring with defiance. Silas took a step back, bewildered. He said. She watched him, gauging his reaction. She looked at the door, then back to the fire, and finally, her gaze settled on Silas's face. She seemed to be searching for something in his eyes, cruelty, lust, or perhaps mercy. She swallowed hard. Her throat worked dryly. When she opened her mouth, Silas expected a croak, or the rough dialect of the mining camps. He expected the voice of a broken, mute servant. He lied, she whispered. The voice was raspy from disuse, but it was clear. And it wasn't the voice of a peasant. It had a cadence, a refined rhythm that spoke of libraries, polished wood floors, and cities far to the east. It was the voice of an educated woman. Silas frowned. Who are you? She shivered, pulling the blanket tighter. He put the sack on me so no one would recognize me. If he sold me as her, the men would have torn me apart. As who? Silas demanded. Who are you? She looked him dead in the eye, and the steel in her spine straightened. My name is Adeline Sterling, she said, and I have just killed the governor of Wyoming. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The fire popped, a loud crack that sounded like a gunshot. Silas stared at her. Adeline Sterling. The name was on every wanted poster from Cheyenne to Salt Lake City. The Black Widow of the West. They said she had poisoned her husband and shot the governor in cold blood before vanishing into the mountains. There was a $5,000 bounty on her head, dead or alive, and Silas had just bought her for $1. You're the most wanted woman in the territory, Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I am, Adeline replied, her violet eyes blazing with a desperate intensity. But I didn't do it. And if you don't help me, an innocent woman hangs, and the men who really killed the governor will take this entire mountain range for themselves. Silas looked at the door, then back at the woman who was worth 5,000 times what he paid for her. The snow was piling up outside, sealing them in. You better start talking, Silas said, pulling up a chair, and don't leave out a single word. The wind battered the cabin walls, a relentless assault that made the heavy timbers groan. But inside, the silence was heavy, for a different reason. Adeline Sterling sat with the rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. Silas didn't speak immediately. He walked to the cast-iron stove, ladled a thick, steaming portion of venison stew into a tin bowl, and set it on the table before her. He added a hunk of stale bread. Eat, he ordered. You look like you're about to faint. You can't tell a story if you're dead. Adeline looked at the food. She hadn't eaten a real meal in 5 days. The aroma of the rosemary and meat made her stomach cramp with sudden, violent hunger. She abandoned her dignity, spooning the stew into her mouth with trembling hands. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the desperation of a starving animal, but the manners of a queen. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, flinching when she touched her split lip. Slow down, Silas muttered, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. Now, tell me about the governor. Adeline pushed the empty bowl away. The warmth of the food gave her strength, and the firelight returning to her violet eyes made them look dangerous. His name was Governor Mitchell, she began, her voice gaining steadiness. He wasn't just a politician. He was my godfather. He raised me after my parents died of cholera in 52. And the man you married? Silas asked, leaning back against the log wall, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Beauregard Sterling. She spat the name like it was poison. A man who owns half the cattle in Wyoming and wants the other half. I thought he was charming. I thought he was kind. But he didn't want a wife, Silas. He wanted access. He wanted the governor's ear. Adeline stood up, the blanket trailing behind her like a royal train. She paced the small room, her agitation growing. They found gold in the Black Hills. Everyone knows that. But Beauregard found something else. Coal. Massive veins of it, right under the reservation lands to the north. Governor Mitchell wouldn't sign the treaty to move the tribes. He refused to break the peace. Silas nodded slowly. He knew the type. Men who looked at a mountain and saw only dollars. So Sterling killed him? He didn't just kill him, Adeline whispered, stopping in front of the fire. He made a show of it. It was the governor's birthday gala. Beauregard poured the wine. He handed me the glass to give to my uncle. I handed it to him. I watched him drink it. 2 minutes later, he was foaming at the mouth, convulsing on the floor. She turned to Silas, tears streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. When the guards came in, Beauregard was screaming that I had poisoned him. He had planted the vial in my purse. I was the heir to the governor's estate. The motive was perfect. The Black Widow, who wanted her inheritance early. "How did you get out?" Silas asked. He was a good judge of character. He had seen liars beg for their lives. Adeline Sterling wasn't begging. She was angry, and anger was usually honest. "My maid, Sarah, she knew the truth. She hid me in a laundry cart. I got out of Cheyenne, but I had no money, no horse. I walked for 3 days until I collapsed near Deadwood. That's where Calloway found me. He realized who I was, or at least he realized I was high-quality stock. He thought I was just a runaway wife until he saw the wanted posters in the last town. That's when he put the sack on my head." "Why sell you?" Silas asked. "The bounty is 5,000. Why sell you for $1? "Because Calloway is a coward," Adeline said bitterly. "He saw the men Beauregard sent. They aren't lawmen, Silas. They're hired killers. The Red Sash Gang. If Calloway tried to turn me in, they would have just killed him and taken me to claim the reward themselves, or silence me permanently. Calloway wanted to dump me and run before they found him with me. He thought selling me to a hermit mountain man was a good way to bury the evidence." Silas looked at the window. The snow was piled halfway up the glass. "If the Red Sash Gang is after you," Silas grumbled, "they won't stop because of a little snow." "They will come," Adeline said, her voice trembling again. "Beauregard can't let me live. I know about the coal. I know about the treaty. If I testify, he hangs." Silas looked at the woman standing in his cabin. She was small, fragile, and terrified. But she had fire. "I paid $1 for a housekeeper," Silas said gruffly, standing up to check the lock on the heavy oak door. "Seems I overpaid. I got a heap of trouble instead." Adeline flinched, looking down at her boots. "I can go. I won't bring his killers to your door. Give me a gun and I'll leave." Silas let out a short, dry laugh. "Leave? In this storm? You'd be a frozen statue before you reach the tree line. Besides—" He turned and looked at her, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. "I don't like bullies, and I don't like men who poison their kin." He pointed to a narrow door near the back of the cabin. "That's the bedroom. I'll sleep out here by the fire. Get some sleep, Mrs. Sterling. Tomorrow we figure out how to keep you alive." Adeline looked at him, stunned. For the first time in weeks, someone wasn't looking at her as a commodity or a criminal. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Silas muttered, laying his Winchester rifle across his lap as he sat back down. "Winter is long, and bullets are cheap." Morning broke with a blinding brilliance. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain world scrubbed clean and covered in 3 feet of fresh, pristine powder. The sun reflected off the snow with a glare that could burn the eyes. Silas was up before dawn. By the time Adeline emerged from the small bedroom, the smell of frying bacon filled the cabin. She had washed her face in the basin Silas provided, and though the bruise on her eye was a lurid purple, she looked less like a ghost and more like a woman. She had found a comb and worked the tangles out of her honey-coloured hair, braiding it simply down her back. Silas paused mid-bite of his biscuit. He had lived alone for 10 years. Seeing a woman in his kitchen, a beautiful woman, despite the rough clothes, felt like a hallucination. "Eat," he said, pointing to the plate. "Then we work. If you stay, you pull your weight." Adeline nodded, eager to prove she wasn't useless. "I can cook. I can mend clothes. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Blackwood." "Silas," he corrected. "Mr. Blackwood was my father. and he was a mean son of a bitch. For the next 2 days, a strange domestic rhythm settled over the cabin. Adeline scrubbed the floorboards until her hands were raw. She mended the tears in Silas's spare shirts. In the evenings, Silas showed her how to load a revolver, guiding her small hands over the cold steel mechanism. He didn't touch her inappropriately, didn't leer. His touch was clinical, instructional, and protective. Adeline found herself watching him. He was a brute of a man, yes. His silence was heavy. But he was gentle with his mule. He moved through the woods without breaking a twig. There was a nobility in his isolation. But the peace was shattered on the morning of the 3rd day. Silas was outside chopping firewood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the canyon walls. Adeline was inside, kneading dough for bread. Suddenly the axe stopped. Adeline froze. She had learned to listen to the silence. The door flew open, and Silas filled the frame. His face was grim. "Get in the cellar," he hissed. "What? Why?" "Riders. 3 of them. Coming up the switchback. They're about a mile out, but the air is clear." I heard the horses. Adeline's heart hammered against her ribs. "Is it them? The red sash?" "Don't know. Can't take the chance. Go." He grabbed her arm and pulled her towards the corner of the room where a heavy rug covered the floor. He kicked the rug aside to reveal a trapdoor. He yanked it open. It was a root cellar, dark, smelling of damp earth and potatoes. "Silas!" She grabbed his wrist. "If they find me—" "They won't," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear. Do not make a sound." She climbed down into the darkness. Silas lowered the heavy door, threw the rug back over it, and dragged the heavy oak table on top of the rug. He quickly set 2 places at the table, then paused. He cursed, grabbed the second plate and cup, and tossed them into the unwashed bucket of water, hiding the evidence of a guest. He sat down, poured himself a coffee, and waited. 10 minutes later, the sound of crunching snow and snorting horses came from the yard. "Hello, the house!" a voice called out. It wasn't friendly. It was the sharp, commanding tone of a man used to getting answers. Silas didn't move. He sipped his coffee. The door burst open without a knock. 3 men stood there. They wore long dusters and wide-brimmed hats. They looked like lawmen, but their badges were tarnished, and their eyes were cold. The man in the lead had a scar running through his eyebrow and a red sash tied around his waist, hidden partially by his coat. The Red Sash Gang. "You deaf mountain man," the leader sneered, stepping into the warmth. He rested his hand on the pearl-handled Colt on his hip. Silas looked up slowly. "Not deaf. Just don't like rude company. You didn't knock." The leader chuckled, looking around the cabin. His eyes scanned the corners, the bed, the stove. "We're looking for a woman. Stolen property. Runaway. Dangerous." "I live alone," Silas said flatly. "Have for 10 years." "Is that so?" The man walked to the stove. He sniffed the air. "Smells like lavender in here. And fresh bread. You bake, big man?" "I eat," Silas said, "and I wash. Lavender keeps the lice off the blankets." The second man, a skinny fellow with a nervous twitch, kicked open the bedroom door. "Empty, boss?" The leader turned back to Silas. He walked closer, invading Silas's personal space. He smelled of whiskey and old blood. "Name's Rourke," the leader said. "We tracked a mule up here from Broken Ridge. Storekeeper said a giant bought a woman from Snake Calloway. Said he brought her this way." Silas didn't blink. "I bought a mule from Calloway. A pack mule. It died halfway up the pass. Wolves got it." I walked the rest of the way. Rourke stared at him, looking for the lie. Silas held the gaze, his face a mask of stone. He was channeling every ounce of danger he possessed. He needed Rourke to believe that pushing him would result in death. "A pack mule," Rourke repeated skeptically. "You calling me a liar?" Silas asked softly. He slowly stood up. He uncoiled to his full height, towering over Rourke by 4 inches. His hand hovered inches from the hunting knife on his belt. The tension in the room was suffocating. Under the floorboards, Adeline held her breath, her hand pressed over her mouth, tears of terror leaking from her eyes. She could hear the boots scraping on the wood right above her head. Rourke weighed his options. There were 3 of them, but this mountain man looked like he could snap a spine with one hand. And the cabin was tight quarters. A gunfight here would be messy. No, Rourke smiled, a tight, ugly expression, just asking questions. But if you see her, she's a murderer. There's a reward, and if someone was hiding her. Rourke's eyes went cold. That person would be guilty of treason, and we hang traitors. Get out of my house, Silas rumbled. Rourke held his gaze for a second longer, then spat on the floor. Let's go, boys. She probably froze to death in the pass anyway. The men turned and filed out. Silas waited until he heard them mount their horses. He waited until the sound of their hooves faded down the mountain path. He didn't move for a full 10 minutes. Finally, he dragged the table aside and threw open the trapdoor. Adeline was huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. Silas reached down and pulled her up effortlessly. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his flannel shirt, sobbing quietly. They're gone, Silas murmured, his hand hesitating before awkwardly patting her hair. They're gone. They'll be back, she wept. They didn't believe you. I heard it in his voice. I know, Silas said, looking at the door. His face was hard now, a general preparing for war. Rourke isn't stupid. He's going down to the tree line to camp. He'll watch the smoke from the chimney. He'll wait for a mistake. Silas pulled away and held her by the shoulders. We can't stay here, he said. If we stay, we die. We have to cross the high pass. We have to go to Silverton. Silverton? Adeline asked, wiping her eyes. That's a week's ride through the worst terrain in the Rockies, in winter. It's the only way, Silas said. I have a brother in Silverton. He's the sheriff, an honest one. If we can get you to him, you can tell your story. And if we don't make it? Silas walked to the wall and took down his heavy buffalo hide coat. He tossed it to her. Then we die free, he said. Pack your things, Adeline. We leave at sundown. They moved like ghosts through a world of white. The moon was a sliver of bone in a sky the color of bruised iron, offering just enough light to see the treacherous path ahead. They had left the mule behind. The snow in the high pass was too deep for the animal, and its braying would have alerted Rourke and his men. Silas broke the trail, his massive thighs ploughing through waist-deep drifts. Adeline followed in his wake, stepping exactly where he stepped. She wore layers of Silas's old wool shirts under the buffalo coat, but the cold still found its way in, biting at her skin like 1,000 needles. They had been walking for 6 hours without stopping. Keep moving, Silas rasped, his voice rough. He paused to let her catch up, checking her face for signs of frostbite. If you stop, your blood slows down. If it slows down, you sleep. If you sleep, you don't wake up. I'm still with you, Adeline panted, her breath pluming in the air. Her legs felt like lead, but the fear of what lay behind them was a potent fuel. They reached the summit of the pass just as the false dawn began to grey the eastern horizon. The wind up here was ferocious, screaming over the jagged peaks. To their left, a sheer drop of 2,000 feet into the abyss. To their right, a wall of ice. We need shelter, Silas shouted over the wind. There's a mining drift about a mile down the ridge. We rest there for an hour. The drift turned out to be a shallow, abandoned test hole dug by some optimistic prospector years ago. It went only 10 feet into the rock, but it was out of the wind. Silas collapsed against the stone wall, his chest heaving. He didn't rest, though. He immediately began checking his rifle. Adeline sank down opposite him, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched him. The giant mountain man looked tired. The lines around his eyes were etched deep. Why? She asked quietly. Silas looked up, his hands pausing on the lever of the Winchester. Why what? Why are you doing this? You could have handed me over. You could have walked away. You're risking your life for a woman you bought for $1. Silas went back to cleaning the gun, scrubbing a speck of rust from the barrel. For a long time, the only sound was the howling wind outside. I wasn't always a mountain man, he said finally, his voice low. 10 years ago, I was Captain Silas Blackwood, Union Cavalry. Adeline's eyes widened. A soldier, a fool, Silas corrected. I came back from the war thinking the fighting was done. I had a wife, Clara. We had a small homestead down in the valley, near Laramie. He stopped, his jaw tightening. The pain in his eyes was fresh, raw, as if 10 years were 10 minutes. A railroad company wanted our land. They had a man, a wealthy man, like your husband. He had the law in his pocket. I refused to sell. One night, while I was in town buying seed, the house caught fire. Adeline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They said it was an accident, Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. A tipped lantern. But I found hoofprints. I found the smell of kerosene. Clara didn't make it out. I went to the sheriff. He laughed, told me to move on. So I did. He looked at Adeline, his dark eyes burning. I moved on to the mountains. But before I left, I paid a visit to the man who ordered the fire. He doesn't order fires anymore. Adeline realized then that the darkness in Silas wasn't just isolation. It was vengeance. He was a man who had dispensed his own justice and then exiled himself to avoid becoming a monster. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Silas grunted. "I see the same look in your eyes that I had in mine. You aren't running because you're guilty, Adeline. You're running because you're grieving, and because you want to make them pay." He reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of dried beef. He broke it in half and handed her the larger piece. "Eat. We have to move. Rourke is a tracker. He'll see where the mule tracks stopped and the boot prints began. He's not far behind." As Adeline chewed the tough meat, she looked at Silas not as a savior, but as a kindred spirit. They were both broken things, forged in fire and ice. "Silas," she said, her voice steady, "when we get to Silverton, if we survive, I promise you, I will clear your name, too. Whatever you did to that man." Silas looked at her, and for the first time, a genuine, albeit small, smile touched his lips beneath the beard. "Let's just worry about keeping our heads attached to our necks for now, darling." The term of endearment slipped out. It hung in the cold air between them, electric and terrifying. Silas cleared his throat awkwardly and stood up. "Let's go. Downhill is harder than uphill." The descent was a nightmare of slick ice and loose shale. They had to move through a narrow canyon known as the Throat, where the walls squeezed together so tight the sun rarely touched the bottom. A frozen creek ran through the center, the ice thick and blue. It was noon, but in the canyon, it felt like dusk. "Stay close to the wall," Silas ordered. "Echo carries in here. If we snap a branch, it sounds like a cannon." They moved in silence for an hour. Adeline's legs were shaking with exhaustion, every step a battle of will. She focused on Silas's broad back, the anchor in her storm. Crack! It wasn't a branch. Silas spun around, shoving Adeline hard against the rock face, just as a bullet chipped stone from the spot where her head had been a second before. "Down!" Silas roared. The boom of a high-powered rifle echoed through the canyon, deafening them. "They're on the ridge!" Silas yelled, raising his Winchester. He fired blindly upward at the rim of the canyon, 70 feet above them. Another shot rang out, kicking up snow at Silas's feet. "Run!" Silas grabbed her hand. "Make for the boulders!" They scrambled across the frozen creek, slipping and sliding on the ice. Bullets hissed around them like angry hornets. Rourke and his men had cut them off. They had ridden around the long way and set an ambush. They dove behind a cluster of massive granite boulders near the bend of the creek. Silas peered over the top, firing 2 quick shots. A man screamed from the ridge. "Got one," Silas grunted. "That leaves 2. Rourke and the twitchy one." "Silas, we're trapped," Adeline cried, pressing herself into the snow. "They have the high ground. Not for long. They have to come down to verify the kill. Rourke won't leave without your body as proof." Silas turned to check on her, and his eyes widened. "Adeline, behind you!" Adeline spun around. The third man, the skinny one, hadn't been on the ridge. He had climbed down the far side and flanked them. He stood 10 feet away, a revolver leveled at Adeline's chest. "Don't move, witch!" the man sneered, his hand shaking. Silas was too far. He couldn't swing his rifle in time. "Drop the gun, big man!" the skinny outlaw shouted at Silas, "or I put a hole in her pretty dress." Silas froze. Slowly, he lowered the Winchester. "Smart," the outlaw grinned. "Now, Mrs. Sterling, you're coming with—" The outlaw never finished his sentence. Silas moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't go for his gun. He drew the throwing knife from his boot in one fluid motion and hurled it. The knife buried itself in the outlaw's shoulder. The man screamed, his gun firing wildly. The bullet went wide, hitting the rock. But at the same moment, a shot rang out from the ridge above. "Rourke!" Silas jerked violently, a spray of red mist erupting from his upper chest. He crumbled to the snow. "Silas!" Adeline screamed. The skinny outlaw was clawing at the knife in his shoulder, trying to raise his gun with his other hand. Silas was down, gasping for air, blood pooling dark and fast on the white snow. Adeline didn't think. She didn't freeze. The terror that had paralyzed her in the cabin was gone, replaced by a cold, white-hot fury. She lunged for Silas's fallen Winchester. It was heavy, far heavier than the revolvers she had practiced with. She struggled to lift it, jamming the stock against her shoulder. The outlaw looked up, eyes widening. "Now, girlie, don't—" Adeline pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her, bruising her shoulder. But her aim was true at this range. The outlaw crumpled backward into the snow, silent. "Silas!" She dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside him. He was pale, his breath bubbling in his chest. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, near the collarbone. It wasn't a heart shot, but he was losing blood fast. "Leave me!" Silas gritted out, his teeth stained red. "Rourke is coming down." "No," Adeline said firmly. She ripped the hem of her petticoat, bunching the fabric into a thick wad. She pressed it hard against the wound. Silas groaned, his eyes rolling back. "I am not leaving you," she hissed. "You didn't leave me." She looked around. The canyon narrowed further ahead. A cave? A overhang? "Get up," she commanded, grabbing his good arm. "Silas, you have to get up. I can't carry you." Silas blinked, focusing on her face. The violet eyes were fierce. She looked like a Valkyrie. With a roar of effort, he forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily on her. Adeline buckled under his weight, but didn't break. "The creek," Silas whispered. "Under the ice. Waterfall ahead. Cave behind it." They staggered forward, leaving a trail of blood drops behind them. Rourke was shouting from the ridge, making his way down the treacherous slope. He would be on the canyon floor in 5 minutes. They reached the waterfall, a frozen curtain of icicles. But behind it, the water still flowed, and the rock curved inward. They squeezed behind the wall of ice into a damp, dark recess, hidden from the world. Adeline lowered Silas to the cold stone floor. He was shivering violently now, shock setting in. "He'll follow the blood," Silas whispered, his voice fading. "No," Adeline said. She grabbed a handful of snow and packed it over the blood trail at the entrance of their hideout. Then she returned to him. She tore open his shirt. The wound was ugly, a jagged hole. "We have to cauterize it," Silas said, his eyes closing, "or I bleed out." Adeline looked at his knife, then at the box of matches in his pocket. She looked at the man who had given up everything for her. "This is going to hurt," she wept. "Do it," Silas whispered. "I trust you." She struck the match. Outside, the crunch of heavy boots on snow grew louder. Rourke was here, and Adeline Sterling, the society wife turned fugitive, held the knife in the flame, preparing to save the only thing in the world she had left to love. The flame hissed as it touched the blade. Adeline bit down on her own lip until it bled, stifling a sob. Silas didn't scream. He couldn't. He was too weak. But his body convulsed, a violent, primal rejection of the agony as the red-hot steel seared his flesh, sealing the jagged wound. The smell of burning skin filled the small, icy cave, mixing with the damp scent of the waterfall. Adeline dropped the knife into the snow, her hands shaking so hard she could barely breathe. "It's done," she whispered, smoothing the hair back from his sweat-slicked forehead. "It's done, Silas." He didn't answer. His breathing was shallow, his skin grey. Outside the curtain of ice, the crunch of boots stopped. "I smell smoke," Rourke's voice drifted in, distorted by the rushing water, "and I smell blood." Adeline froze. She looked at Silas. He was unconscious, his massive frame limp against the rock. He couldn't fight. If Rourke came in, they were both dead. She looked at the Winchester rifle lying in the dirt. It was empty. She had the throwing knife, pulled from the dead outlaw's shoulder, and Silas's heavy revolver, which had 2 bullets left. She picked up the revolver. It was heavy in her hand. "Come out, Mrs. Sterling," Rourke shouted, closer now. "Come out, and I'll make it quick. Make me come in there, and I'll drag you back to your husband in pieces." Adeline looked at Silas one last time. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a soft, fleeting touch of grace in a hellish world. "Stay here," she whispered to his sleeping form. She stood up. She didn't hide. She walked towards the wall of ice. She stepped through the frozen curtain and out into the canyon floor. Rourke was standing 10 feet away, his gun leveled at the waterfall. He grinned when he saw her. He looked like a wolf who had finally cornered the lamb. "There she is," Rourke sneered. "Where's the giant? Bled out like a stuck pig?" Adeline stood tall. She wore the buffalo coat, which swallowed her small frame, but her eyes were cold violet flint. "He's dead," she lied, her voice steady. "You killed him." Rourke chuckled, holstering his gun slowly. He didn't see her as a threat. She was just a woman, a commodity. Shame, he was a big one. "Now toss that gun over here, darling." Adeline raised Silas's revolver. It wavered in her grip. "You think you can shoot me?" Rourke laughed, stepping closer. "You're a society wife. You pour tea. You don't kill men." "I didn't kill the governor," Adeline said softly. "I know." Rourke shrugged. "Beauregard did. Everyone in the inner circle knows. But the man pays in gold, and gold buys the truth." "He paid you to bring me back?" "Dead or alive. Alive costs extra." Rourke took another step. "Give me the gun." Adeline lowered the barrel slightly. Rourke smirked, lunging forward to grab her. In that split second, Adeline didn't shoot at him. She dropped to her knees, aiming at the patch of ice directly beneath Rourke's feet. Ice that had been weakened by the thermal vent that fed the waterfall. Bang! The bullet shattered the ice. Rourke's eyes widened in shock as the ground beneath him gave way. With a shout, he plunged into the freezing, churning water below the ice shelf. The current grabbed him instantly. He clawed at the jagged edge of the ice, his fingers slipping. "Help me!" he screamed, the water dragging him under the ice sheet toward the dark rapids downstream. Adeline stood up, looking down at him. She watched his face, the face of a man who had hunted them like animals. "I am not a society wife anymore," she whispered. Rourke's grip failed. He slipped beneath the surface, swept away into the darkness of the mountain's veins. The canyon fell silent, save for the wind. Adeline dropped the gun and sank into the snow, the adrenaline crashing. She crawled back through the ice curtain. Silas was still breathing. She curled up beside him, wrapping her body around his to share her warmth. "We won," she whispered into the dark. "Don't you dare die on me now, Silas Blackwood. We won." The journey to Silverton took 4 more days. It was a blur of agony. Adeline made a travois sled from the pine branches and the buffalo coat, dragging Silas's unconscious weight through the snow. She walked until her boots fell apart, wrapping her feet in strips of her dress. She hunted rabbits with snares Silas had shown her how to make. She fed him broth, snow water, and whispered stories to him to keep him tethered to the world. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the mining town of Silverton, Adeline looked less like a human and more like a wild spirit of the Rockies. She dragged the sled down the main street at high noon. The townspeople stopped and stared. Miners dropped their picks. Whores leaned over the balconies of the saloon. They saw a woman in rags, dragging a giant man on a makeshift sled. She stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the mud, gasping. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall, dark-haired, with the same jawline as Silas, Sheriff Tom Blackwood. He looked at the sled. He looked at the woman. His eyes went wide. "Silas?" Tom ran down the steps, falling to his knees beside his brother. He checked for a pulse. "He's alive! Get the doctor, now!" He turned to Adeline, who was trying to push herself up. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his voice gentle but confused. "What happened?" Adeline looked at him, her face caked in dirt and blood, her violet eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying light. "My name is Adeline Sterling," she rasped, "and I have come to collect a debt." 3 weeks later, the courtroom in Silverton was packed. Every bench was full. Men were standing in the back, hanging off the rafters. The story had spread across the territory. The mountain man and the runaway bride. The beauty and the beast of the Bitterroots. Beauregard Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table, looking immaculate in a tailored suit. He looked confident. He had brought his own lawyers, his own paid witnesses. He was the grieving husband, here to reclaim his mentally unstable wife who had murdered her uncle. Sheriff Tom Blackwood stood by the door, his arms crossed. Silas stood next to him. Silas was still pale, his arm in a sling, but he was upright. He had shaved his beard, revealing a strong, scarred jaw. He wore a clean suit Tom had lent him. He looked like what he once was, a captain. "Call the defendant," the judge ordered. The back doors opened. Adeline walked in. She wasn't wearing rags. The women of the town had rallied around her. She wore a simple, high-collared dress of deep blue wool. Her hair was pinned up. She held her head high. But over her face, she wore a veil, a heavy black lace veil that obscured her features. A murmur went through the crowd. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge said, "you stand accused of the murder of Governor Mitchell. How do you plead?" Adeline walked to the witness stand. She didn't look at the judge. She turned and looked directly at Beauregard. "Not guilty," she said clearly. Beauregard's lawyer stood up. "Objection! This woman is a known hysteric. She was found wandering the mountains with a savage. Her mind is gone." "My mind is perfectly clear," Adeline said. She reached up and lifted the veil. The courtroom gasped. Her face was healed, but the strength in it was new. "I have testimony," Adeline announced. "Not just mine." Silas stepped forward. He placed a heavy, leather-bound ledger on the judge's bench. "What is this?" the judge asked. "That," Silas rumbled, his voice filling the room, "is the ledger from Snake Calloway's saddlebags. We found his horse frozen in the pass. It seems Calloway kept detailed records of who paid him for what, including a payment of $500 from a Mr. Beauregard Sterling to dispose of the woman and ensure silence regarding the coal surveys." Beauregard's face went white. He stood up, knocking his chair over. "This is a lie. That man is a hermit, a nobody." "That man," Adeline said, her voice cutting through the noise, "is Captain Silas Blackwood, a decorated war hero, and the man who saved my life when you sold me for $1. Adeline turned to the jury. "My husband poisoned the governor because he wouldn't break the treaty. He wanted the coal. He framed me. And when that failed, he sent the Red Sash gang to kill me." She pointed at Beauregard. "He is the monster, not the man in the mountains." The trial lasted 3 hours. With the ledger and the testimony of a telegraph operator Tom Blackwood had tracked down, who confirmed Beauregard's telegrams to the hitmen, the jury didn't even leave the room to deliberate. "Guilty," the foreman said, "of murder and conspiracy." As the bailiffs dragged a screaming Beauregard away, Adeline didn't watch him. She stepped down from the stand and walked toward Silas. The crowd parted for them. They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright winter sun. "So," Silas said, looking down at her, "you're a free woman, Adeline. You have the inheritance, you have the mines, you're the richest woman in the territory." Adeline looked at the busy street, at the fine carriage waiting for her. Then she looked at the mountains rising in the distance, wild and white and free. She looked at Silas. She saw the man who had bought her when she was worthless, who had bled for her, who had treated her with honor when the world treated her with scorn. "I don't want the mines," she said. Silas blinked. "What do you want?" Adeline reached into her pocket. She pulled out a single, battered silver dollar, the same coin Silas had paid Calloway that day in Broken Ridge. She had found it in Calloway's pocket when she searched the body in the river, before the current took him. She took Silas's large, calloused hand and pressed the coin into his palm. "I want to buy something," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears. "What can you buy for $1? Silas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "A partner," Adeline smiled, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. "A real kiss, full of promise and fire. I hear the cabin needs a woman's touch, and I'm quite good at baking bread." Silas looked at the coin, then at the woman who held his heart. He closed his fingers over the silver. "Sold," he whispered. They didn't look back. They mounted 2 horses and turned them towards the tree line, riding back towards the high country, where the air was clean, the world was quiet, and love was the only law that mattered. And that, my friends, is the legend of Adeline Sterling and Silas Blackwood. History books might mention the governor's death, but the real story was hidden in the mountains. It reminds us that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't bought with gold, but with courage, loyalty, and a single silver dollar. They say, if you go up to the Bitterroot Range today, you can still find the ruins of a cabin where the wildflowers grow a little thicker, planted by a woman who found paradise in the middle of nowhere. If this story touched your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. What would you have done in Adeline's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.